Hello to everyone turning into a Res Publica Politics special podcast on the situation in Belarus. My name is Richard Gill, Senior Editor, and I'm joined today from Gateshead by Emma Wells. Thank you for joining us, Emma.
Hello, hi. It's great to be here. My name's Emma Wells. I'm 23 years old and I am the author of The Road to Belarusian Democracy, which is a book about how Belarus was forged in the end of the Soviet Union and the Chernobyl ecological disaster. So today we're just going to talk a little bit more about the protests, sort of the history behind the protests and what's brought that on in present day.
That's amazing. Thanks, Emma. So let's get right into it. In August last year, protests began after a contested presidential election that officially returned the long-standing President Lukashenko as victor, but there were many allegations of electoral rigging by the regime. As of 2 weeks ago, over 30,000 people have been detained, and calls have been mounting from the West for a transitional government to take power. What can you tell us about how Belarus got to this point?
And so without a shadow of a doubt, 2020 has been a year of Belarus stepping massively into the future. There's been unprecedented solidarity, unity. Belarus is prepared for this year of protest for over a quarter of a century. Radical political transformation has completely engulfed Belarusian society. I would say that's something that has not been covered whatsoever on Western outlets of media. Maybe at the start it was really overwhelming that the protests had sort of broken out and that this was coming to light. But definitely at this point in time, February 2021, there is really limited information, if any, that's ever sort of shown on mainstream media. And I would find that everything that has sort of been publicised recently has come to light through social media. So basically, following the Belarusian presidential election running from the 4th to the 8th of August in 2020, Alexander Lukashenko was re-elected to the 6th term in office, with official results suggesting him to have won 80% of the vote. However, the opposition candidate is claimed to have won 60% of the first round vote. So the election's been marred by allegations of widespread electoral fraud, and Belarus is often considered the lasting legacy of the Soviet Union in terms of its legacy within Europe. It is called the last dictatorship. And this is definitely something that has been prevalent within the protests, sort of the violence that's been shown throughout the regime, the denial of free speech and a political identity in itself. Throughout the 2020 Belarusian democracy protests especially, it has been proven that Belarusian people are ready for change. And this is a change that Lukashenko was absolutely not ready to give them. So with political protest foundational to the origins of the modern nation of Belarus, this is something that was foundational following its succession from the USSR upon the USSR's disintegration. It is evident that that is a political identity that has been followed through the 30 years that modern Belarus has existed. In terms of a little bit of information sort of where we are right now, I run an Instagram page called at The Road to Belarusian Democracy, which talks about the protest in present day, and a really great Instagram page that I would recommend if anyone's interested in looking at this is at Voices from Belarus. That gives a daily rundown of everything that's gone on. When they said that the revolution would not be televised, they did not account for social media, which is something that is so important right now, absolutely. Every single day you're able to access statistics, figures, a really intensive breakdown of everything that is happening. I physically don't think this page could give more information. So if anyone's interested in finding a little bit more out, then I would really recommend following that. So in terms of a little bit of the history of Belarus, which is sort of a little bit of an extract from my book and a little bit more information in terms of what we're discussing today and the more modern, current day contemporary protests that are going on. All right, so in 1990, Belarus declared its independence from the Soviet Union, and that was just 1 year before the entity officially collapsed. The disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991 is yet to be defined in academic consensus. However, through examination of paradoxical theories of modernisation undertaken by the Soviet Union, it is evident to see that such a system did not apply to the Soviet ideology itself. So there was definitely a period of stagnation. So there's the idea of unleashing change without producing systematic change. The Communist Party was absolutely destroyed in the attempt to create an alternate modernity. And there was no Soviet mechanism for internal systematic change. So obviously things are starting to progress. We're moving into the 90s, things are starting to get more modernized. The Soviet Union simply did not function in a modern society. It was not compatible with how people wanted to live. All right. So in terms of what that produced within the Soviet Union, it was a society that functioned upon hiding the truth, opposing to dealing with products of Soviet disaster. So, for example, the Chernobyl disaster, it was easy for them to sort of sweep that under the carpet and to hide that. And that facilitated the creation of aggrieved nationalism. All right, and that sort of contradicts the apparent ideology of modernizing Soviet authorities. So, as Gorbachev is sitting at the head of the Soviet Union at this point, he created the idea of glasnost and perestroika. Do apologise for my absolutely shocking pronunciation of these terms. It does come part and parcel with the very broad accent, so I do apologise for that in advance. As I continue through pronouncing all of these very Eastern European names, apologies if I get it wrong.
And me too.
But yeah, so Glasnost promised a more sort of open society within the USSR, and that was obviously completely denied. It was a surface level promise. That was absolutely the limitations of it. So following Belarus's succession from the USSR, we have Shushkevich, who was elected as the first Belarusian leader. All right, and he holds this position until Lukashenko's election in 1994. So the original leader of Belarus attempted to facilitate the creation of a Belarus completely free of its Soviet past. We're looking towards Western leaders in plight of modernization. But upon Lukashenko's appointment to office, this change was completely turned on its head. So Belarusian political attention turned away from the West and towards Russia, further reinstating Soviet-era functions, and that's sort of symbolic of a Soviet Belarus. So we're under the guise of modernization and basically just going completely back to the original Belarus under a completely USSR blanket. So whilst modern Belarus was initially founded upon social democratic reform, this was a massive part of the development of the Commonwealth of Independent States, and that's the establishment of Eurasian post-Soviet states. So very, very ironically, in 1993, Lukashenko sat as the chairman of the Anti-Corruption Committee of Belarusian Parliament. Can you truly believe that I would be saying that looking back at where we are right now? And in this role, he accused 70 senior officials, including the president of Belarus at the time, of corruption. So this corruption was stealing state funds and utilising them for personal gain. And whilst this instigated a vote of no confidence in leadership, it later appeared that accusations against everyone that was sort of put under this blanket were completely without merit. So the alleged perpetrator was not responsible for that, basically. So following this removal, Lukashenko stood in the following election and he won presidential power. So not only did he falsify the claims against the former leader, but he actively stopped the development of Belarus in the direction of westernized democracy. So he advocated regressive Soviet-esque style of governance, and the Belarusian public were completely hoodwinked of their chance for democratic freedom. Bearing in mind, this is somebody that they democratically elected in 1991 following their succession from the USSR. Everything is completely turned on its head at this point. In 1994, obviously, Lukashenko was elected in, but they were under false pretenses. So how much can we actually say that that was a fair democratic election? It completely juxtaposes the whole situation. So Lukashenko branded his claims as aiding the wider population of Belarus, when in reality, the lies facilitated his own agenda of authoritarian control. He created a Belarus in the shadow of Russian development, which essentially reinstated the power of the Soviet political framework, and that's under the guise of modernized politics and independence. Since his election, Lukashenko has promoted a pan-Eastern Slavic and Soviet-style ideology. Okay, so as the concept of Belarusian national identity is weak and limited, the small democratic opposition to his authoritarian regime have been unable to resist the Russification and regression into the shadows of Soviet-style polity. So this has sort of facilitated a cooperative between the two states that is absolutely stronger than ever. This blindsides the general public into subservience to Russia as a satellite state, and will return to that sort of USSR mentality rather than a post-Soviet state whatsoever. It could not be classed as that at all. So In terms of the political system within Belarus, apologies. So that is there's legislators that reside in two separate assemblies. Okay, so there's chambers or houses. The president sits as head of state, and the executive power is exercised by the government, and the prime minister sits at the top of the government, appointed by the president. So whilst the legislative power sits in a sort of de jure parliament that is divided, Lukashenko actually has complete control over all aspects of legislation, and that facilitates a dictatorship. There is nothing that can pass through this parliament, this entire system, that he can't overturn or overthrow or have a complete say on. So he completely dominates that, and in turn that makes it very, very difficult, whilst he is still in power, to achieve any change whatsoever towards the democratic movement's goals, towards their desires, anything like that. So not only is their entire system a relic of dictatorship, of this Soviet-style top-heavy governance, but their economic structure is also a relic of Soviet communist governments as well. And this further exemplifies his dictatorship style of politics. So Lukashenko launched a plight of market socialism, whereby the economic system involved social ownership of the means of production within the framework of a market economy. So basically, this just sort of expanded the state's right to intervene in the management of private enterprise. So Lukashenko has maintained government control over key industries and the large-scale privatizations, and this is seen in former Soviet republics and Western capitalist democracies. So in terms of exports for Belarus, the main export market for Belarus is agricultural and industrial produce, and that sort of lies within Russia. So their main export is to Russia, which again, very, very reminiscent of Soviet governance, and sort of the idea that we're harvesting a lot of not even natural resources, but labor at this point, and entirely running for that. So massively reliant on that for their economy as well. So everything is sort of central to how Belarus stands right now, really rests on Russia at this point. So obviously that demonstrates the really close economic links between the nations, and that's a very neo-colonial alliance and a resurgence of Soviet power structures, and very much evident of exploitation by Russian powers. So peat is the nation's most valuable mineral resource, and that's used within chemical industries for fuel and fertilizer. And there's a lot of dense forestation in the country, which was massively impacted by Chernobyl. So there is a lot of wasted potential within the nation, and what they would be able to sort of export, and sort of agriculturally how that limits them because of this pre dissolution of the USSR, the disaster that did happen in 1986, and where that left them. So now that has left them in an economically vulnerable position, and again reliant on Russia. So these are sort of three different factors that massively play into one another and the development of Belarus in the modern day, as well as just how it's completely stayed magnetized to Russia at this point. So in terms of modern day, the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 has seen drops of up to 12% in European economies. All right, and this is according to Belta News, which is the sort of a Belarusian state TV news. So the Belarusian economy only suffered a decline between 1.5% and 2.5%. So as I say, this is a state-owned national news agency of the Republic of Belarus, and this is operating, again, very Soviet era, very Soviet-esque of their functioning, sort of how much information they actually give away. The legislation that they do actually televise and produce is obviously very, very skewed in favour of promoting Belarusian nationalism and massively highlighting the pros, the positives, and how everyone else outside of Belarus within the European situation definitely has massively struggled. And that sort of really feeds into Lukashenko's own personal views of COVID. In terms of what he has said on the matter, it's non-existent. He is very much denied that COVID is a problem. There's limited to zero help available for Belarusian people at this point.
Wow.
And sort of not just medically, economically, everything like that. It is a case of this will pass, but not even in a sense that we too shall be great again, in a sense that this does not exist, so that's why it shall pass. Which is obviously a massively different approach to the rest of the leaders definitely on a, well, probably not a global scale, obviously looking at Trump's reaction, but definitely on a Eurocentric scale. And when we look at sort of the denial of this is a massive part of feeding into how the protests came to boiling point, I would say. So, as I said, Belta is the state-owned national news agency of the Republic of Belarus, and this demonstrates the direct lineage of Belarusian media coverage from the oppressive Soviet-style propaganda. So this is further emphasised in the banning of Belta's Director General, all right, from entering the European Union between 2011 and 2016. All right, so this is an EU sanction against Belarus following protests over the 2010 presidential election. So the EU Council stated that he was responsible for relaying state propaganda in the media, which has supported and justified the repression of democratic opposition and of civil society on December 19th, 2010, and falsified information. So when we sort of look at the lineage between the news agency stemming from secretive belief systems of the Soviet Union, the controlled news system, and we combine that with the EU's condemning and sort of the framework of the publication as well, this suggests that Belarusian authorities attempted to utilise the COVID-19 pandemic as a propaganda tool to facilitate this massively West versus East rhetoric. So that's very, very remnant of Cold War style propaganda. And the modernisation of such arguments has demonstrated that the agenda of the Belarusian regime and why they earned their reputation as the last dictatorship of Europe. Why that is so prevalent. I mean, looking back 2010, we're talking 11 years ago, and we're still facing the exact same repetition, the exact same feeding of these lies, of this falsified information, of the glory of Belarus in the shadow of everyone else. But the reality of it is so falsified that at this point we don't actually know what the truth really is, and the statistics that come along with that. So yes, that's sort of where Belarus sits within a COVID sense, which is obviously still ongoing. We're talking 200 plus days ago now, since the protests started, and nearly a whole year since COVID started, and it's still a state of denial at this point. Okay, so in terms of like economics as well as social policy, it is not only, obviously, it's not only economically that Lukashenko's policy is akin to that of the USSR, but his social policy is massively inherited, and it massively mirrors the former colonial power. So in 2015, Lukashenko introduced a bill to introduce a fine on the unemployed population. So that's very comparable to the Soviet Union bill declaring a struggle against social parasites. And that really reinforces the social hierarchy, and that's massively centerfold to Belarusian society. So this idea is sort of attempting to pit the proletariat against one another, and that displaces social angst. That is very much a move that is calculated to disperse protest, to disperse the counter movement against Lukashenko. The Soviet offense of a social parasite, essentially, operates across the class spectrum. Obviously, the Soviet model of communism is without class, but debatable. And this sort of is based on an individual's contribution towards society. So this demonstrates a clear lineage between the two, between this and the 2015 bill. So the discourse between Belarus and the West is massively fueled by this Cold War rhetoric of us and them. And this sort of social parasite bill is something that I would say is definitely prevalent within other societies. The idea that if you're at the bottom, if you're not working, you are the scum. Like that is a massively dangerous belief across capitalist societies. We can't deny that. But this is different within Belarus, because it sort of comes across that class barrier. It takes the people who maybe wouldn't have to work financially, they don't need to work, and still puts them in this bracket and offers a tax on that. It's very much the same idea, but it is in a nation that economically people struggle a hell of a lot more than they do on like a wider range. Obviously there's poverty everywhere, that's undeniable, but on a wider scale, people are more impoverished, people receive less financially month to month. So this idea of like attacking across the spectrum is a very Soviet idea, I would say, to diminish class as a problem, but in the process it doesn't actually offer anyone any help. It doesn't physically make any social reform. It just continues to diminish any chance of social mobility or anything like that. As well, in terms of the regressive policy that Lukashenko has in place, they are actually the last nation in Europe to still use the death penalty, which is something massively shocking in 2021 to think that we would have a nation that still does that within Western society. But obviously that is a massive part feeding into his sort of label as the last dictator. Very regressive agenda. So obviously the modern political elections in Belarus have massively come under fire from international ridicule. So this is namely because of Lukashenko's violent suppression of political opposition. So following a 1995 referendum, the two official languages of Belarus are listed as Belarusian and Russian. So again, that's a forced societal link between the two nations. And that's like in the modern relationship to the neo-colonial power dynamic between the Soviet Union motherland idea, like the idea that we are inherited from this. But in terms of on an ethnic level, this was something that was never inherited. Obviously, there has been a lot of international migration between the two nations. But this is not something that ethnically is native to Belarus. So it is very much a forced sort of agenda within there. So the weakness of a national identity slows down both due to the speed and success of democratization and marketization within post-Soviet transition. So in Belarus, an ethno-cultural identity never developed prior to its subservience to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet ideology devoured and erased the last remaining traces of Belarusian national identity. So Belarusian identity is largely Soviet in its manner, but by its very nature, the Soviet Belarusian identity, as exemplified by Lukashenko, cannot sustain the political and economic reform as built on nostalgia from the past. So following the dissolution of the USSR, Lukashenko's Belarus, apologies, Freudian slip, did not fully undergo post-colonial transition, and that demonstrates an unwillingness to undergo a process of democratization alongside civic nation building and marketization. A rejection of these ideals is incompatible to the evolutionary transition. In Belarus and Ukraine especially, socio-cultural pluralism, civil society and independent economic factors were absent when they became independent states from the USSR. So this means that civil society had to be reinvented opposed to resurrected in these post-communist states. So national unity and consolidation were proclaimed as state goals to establish and forge community within the nation, and that's rather than something that's simply been inherited from the former territory of the USSR. So in terms of the agenda prior to 2020's democratic protests, it's very much a mood of civil unrest. It's very much a state of oppression, of just limited change socially, economically, limited progression within any sort of democratic movement that wanted to gain any traction. And the Belarusian democracy movement is absolutely an umbrella term, and that basically just describes the opposition groups against the authoritarian governments. So these leftist groups have utilised the Belarusian white, red, white flag as a symbol of their defiance of Lukashenko's regime. In 1918, this flag was used by the Belarusian Democratic Republic before Belarus became a Soviet republic, but it's not been officially banned from public use. However, it is being treated by authorities as an unregistered symbol. So that means that the demonstration of this flag by political activists or sports fans can absolutely lead to arrests, confiscation of the flag, and to be issued a fine. So the colours of the white, red, white flag are based on the original coat of arms traditional to Belarusian lands. So after Belarus regained its independence from the USSR in 1991, the white, red, white flag was reinstated under the official presidency, envisioning the creation of a modern Belarus. So we've got new movement towards change in social structures, and obviously this went in. Sorry, I do apologise about that. The washing machine's just come on. So as we sort of transition into Lukashenko's leadership, we see that this is not something that's any longer representative of what he wants to achieve, what he wants to facilitate a Belarus in light of. And he did actually hold a election and changed the flag, which is now the flag that you'll see, which is red and green. I mean, the best way to see that, if you type Belarusian on your phone and it comes up with the little emoji underneath, so you can visualize what that looks like. Obviously, hopefully soon, when the leadership changes and the official flag becomes white, red, white, that'll be something that changes as well. Really, really small scale, but you know, these things and how we represent. So yes, the massively critical turning point for the Belarusian protests right now was signified on May 12th. And this is when people began to sort of register their political presidential ambitions alongside Lukashenko. So the successes throughout the 2020 protests have been attempted and facilitated by the opposition for years. And in terms of how that was met, it was met in exactly the same way by Lukashenko's regime. It was met by violent oppression. It was met by dispersing the political movements apart. And largely they've all failed. This is why Lukashenko has continued to remain in office for as long as he has. So what we have seen in the 2020 protests is a massive change of pace, and something that has never been seen before in terms of like attempted overthrowing in a completely democratic way and through peaceful protest nonetheless, to rid office of Lukashenko. So in terms of who we have at the forefront of this movement presently, so we have Tikhanovskaya, which is Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who is the current face of the movement. So she is a human rights activist, and she ran in place of her husband, who was imprisoned early on when he announced his own political ambition and running for presidency. He's actually still in prison under falsified charges, which is obviously something that, it's incredible to think that he's been able to be kept in prison under these completely falsified charges for the best part of a year. But obviously his wife was able to take his place and keep the momentum of what they'd created going. So he is considered by Amnesty International to be a prisoner of conscience, and his name is Sergei. He is a video blogger and a pro-democracy activist. He was arrested just 2 days after his announcement to run against Alexander Lukashenko, and the leader of the Country for Life pro-democracy movement. So that's what his branch of this Belarusian democracy movement was. So he was charged with preparing mass riots. And this has been, as I say, extended until February 2021 under falsified claims. So following Sergei's arrest, Svetlana took over in the race for presidential control. And following Lukashenko's re-election, widespread protests broke out across Belarus, with the government responding with harsh violence to quell the flames of protest. So the violent and abhorrent treatment of protesters is very comparable to the Great Terror of 1937, under which Stalin led a brutal terror campaign to eliminate dissenting members of the Communist Party and anyone else considered to be a threat, with an estimated 750,000 believed to have been murdered. So throughout this campaign, more than 1 million individuals were sent to forced labour camps known as gulags. And the 2020 protests have similarly faced violent persecution by the authorities, with arrests and claims of violence, including claims of torture, increasing the week after the election. And that has been completely resultant in international sanctions called for against perpetrators. So if we fast forward this to today and what sort of is happening currently in 2021, now that we've sort of gone over the prelude and the special relationship between Belarus and Russia, and sort of where democratically Lukashenko lies his agenda. So as I said, we'll have Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who is the political leader of the democratic movement and Lukashenko's opponent. So before running for president, she was an English teacher and an interpreter. She worked alongside children affected by the Chernobyl disaster, and she was, as an activist, she still is an activist. She is the #1 activist right now. So she's married to Sergei, who originally ran as the opposition, as I said just before. But when she announced she would run in his place, she was endorsed by the prominent opposition campaigns who'd been barred from registering into the elections. So not only is this massively prominent because it's a call for democracy within Belarus, but it's also a call for gender equality within Belarus. And this is something that Lukashenko has sort of fed into his own agenda and own campaign, and sort of said Belarus is not ready for a woman president, but it's very evident that Belarus is ready for change. It's very evident that Belarus wants not only female leadership, but democratic leadership. So the night before the election, the original election, which was the 4th to the 8th of August, as I said before, police detained the senior members of staff from her campaign and forced herself into hiding in Minsk. And she reappeared on election day at the polling station, which is obviously a massive thing. She hadn't been taken away by Lukashenko. She's sort of been able to avoid the same fate as her husband at this point. So this is a massive positive step for the movement and everything that she stands for. So she said that she ran in this position out of love to free her husband from prison, and she's vowed to free all political prisoners from Belarus and to introduce democratic reforms to the country and move away from the union treaty with Russia, which many Belarusian opposition figures view as an infringement on the country's sovereignty. So as I sort of went into great detail on before, this relationship with Russia is not something that Belarusian individuals are actively going forward looking for. This is not something that they want. She's also pledged to set out a referendum on returning to the original draft of the 1994 Belarusian constitution, and that reinstates a limit of 2 terms for the president, which is something that has been violated under Lukashenko's rule. That's not something that you can call democracy under this current model. So her main goal is to establish a free and fair election. She views the current election as illegitimate, and that's due to the government's refusal to register Lukashenko's main political opponents as candidates. And she's also pledged to deliver a plan for transparent and accountable elections within 6 months of taking office. So that's pretty much where we're at this point, and the agenda of the democratic reform movement, the protests themselves, and where they've sort of sprung from.
Well, that's fantastic. It's actually a really interesting point that it had never occurred to me when I was doing my background research for this interview, that what we're looking at with Belarus isn't so much a case of, excuse me, of democratic reversal, like we might be used to hearing about in other parts of the world today, but it's really a case of democratic evolution, that this is something that they've never really had an awful lot of, and it's very much a work in progress.
Absolutely. I mean, it's very hard, as I was sort of talking about with national identity and how that's not something that Belarus has. It's very hard to have something that you can want to go back to that's not in living memory. So if we're looking back to 1918, I mean, there's not anybody that's going to have been living through that experience who would be alive today to push forward for the movement. Like there is not a lived shared experience that Belarusian nationals can look back to and fill with nostalgia and move towards. So this is something that they have completely forged of their own accord, of their own desires, which I think is a very impressive and idyllic sort of state, because it completely, it comes from a place of modernity. It doesn't come from an idea of what once was, this idea of we were once great, let's return to greatness. It's very much a case of we will be great, let us make our own way to greatness.
No, that's definitely really interesting. Of course, it sort of brings to mind the distinction between the national and the international. So I'm curious about whether or not there's been any input from the Belarusian diaspora in any of this. Like I know earlier this month, the international community heard that Belarusian security forces have a dedicated division that targets political opponents of Lukashenko that are actually residing outside of Belarus. Is this something that's kind of gone under the radar, or is this something that has been there as long as Lukashenko's been there?
I mean, in terms of sort of what this represents, so we're looking at BIPOL, which is the the security unit that is charged with what you're saying. I mean, I say charged, I mean on a citizen's arrest scale. Like, obviously
Sure.
that's not something that's politically recognized internationally, anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
These are allegations that have come to light and very much been sort of cast aside by not only politics within Belarus, it's completely ignored, but on an international scale, I would say that it's not at the forefront of the political agenda. Like, what we're looking at is a violation of human rights there,
Mm-hmm.
and what help they're actually receiving is not reflective of that whatsoever. In terms of international Belarusian community and their call for democracy, again, this is something that's massively prevalent on an Instagram community, sort of promoting that. And I would say that that's not something I've seen any of on the news. I mean, I don't know whether I've just missed that or what, but the coverage just simply hasn't been there. And what you can see, so there's a lot of, again, Instagram pages that I follow through my own page that are like Belarusian in Lithuania, Belarusian in Chicago, things like that, like completely on a global scale, just posting not only their thoughts on the movement, but their solidarity, the protests that they themselves create. Obviously, that international community is going to be a lot smaller than the protests that are going on within Belarus.
Mm-hmm.
The way that they could facilitate something as large or as widespread, because it simply doesn't have the news coverage.
Sure.
In terms of the BIPOL and that agency and sort of like what they are, they're very much a secretive agenda. I know they have to undergo sort of like 3 years of training and sort of to get their position. They learn I think it's Lithuanian as well as Russian, two languages. I'm not quite sure on the second language alongside Belarusian, but obviously that's something that is very much like a spy and MI5 type agency.
Mm-hmm.
It's not simply secret police. It's not a law enforcement. It's an intelligence gathering agency. It's something to wipe out opponents, and that's something that was focused on like sort of political opponents to Lukashenko. But also in January, it came to light that there was an audio in relation to this agency who basically stated we'll build camps with barbed wire. So again,
Wow.
relating to what I said about the Great Terror, they're not afraid to imprison people in political camps, in anything like that. Then that is not something that seems like an infringement of human rights, a violation of that. That is very much something that they're willing to undergo within their political agenda, and they just view that as another step in harming and suspending this democratic process. They think this is something that will cause a terror within the people who are sort of pushing for democratic reform. So,
it does definitely link to what you were saying about this all tying into the Cold War. It does sound like something out of a John le Carre novel, I have to admit.
Yeah, it really does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's very subtle, I would say, but obviously when you're living through something, and it's very easy to say with hindsight what that was. But everything that we see is very much hearsay, and the lack of coverage on the news. I mean, we're lucky that we do have social media as a tool to update people, and not only that people are willing to gather so much information to help spread that, because they know that is the only way that this information will get out.
It is definitely very impressive just how much participation social media seems to be able to empower.
Absolutely. I mean, once you start following the right pages for anything, not just this democratic movement, like you will become an expert in a matter of days, because there's so much content, it's unbelievable. But this is very much the positive social aspect of social media, I would say.
And it's interesting sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I think I was just about to say the same sentence again, reworded. I do apologise for interrupting. You go ahead.
No, all I was going to say was it's interesting that there does seem to be this disconnect between what everybody might know from listening to world news and the, not to endorse this phrase, but the mainstream media, and what people can find themselves on social media.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think this has an impact in terms of why we might see some Western countries responding to the Belarusian protests as they do? Like, I know just earlier the United States State Department put out a statement calling for the regime to begin dialogue with the Belarusian people. And based on what you're saying, it does seem a bit of a copy and paste statement. Is that a fair analysis?
Absolutely, I would agree. So I think you're talking about the Ned Price statement, which was sort of issued on his Twitter account. And he is the US Department of State spokesperson. So basically, Price is just a political advisor. And in terms of presidential change and sort of presidential alignment with Russia, this does obviously suggest that this discourse is going to change. But very much what you are saying, it is a copy and paste job. I mean, like, if we look at where this is at now, so after the elections, after the elections, Svetlana was forced to flee to Lithuania, and that's in fear of repercussions that would possibly affect her children. So again, that it's in itself is a massive infringement upon her personally, for her political actions, for her call to arms in this peaceful democratic protest. On August 11th, the Lithuanian foreign minister advised that she was safe within Lithuania, and that also acknowledged that she had a few options, but that in itself that's not a statement saying we are an ally. That is a statement saying, yeah, we're not going to do the same, which being middle ground is not taking a stance on it, you know? There's that saying where it's like, if you say nothing, then you choose the side of the oppressor, which is obviously very prevalent right now. So as of February 2021, she does remain in political exile from Belarus, and the campaign and sort of is continuing to move towards democracy. As of February 1st, she did receive a pledge from the British Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, and he said that Britain and their partners from the US would work in cooperation with her to pressure Lukashenko into resolving the crisis in Belarus. I mean, tell me what that actually does, what that actually pledges. Like, fair enough, they can't release every aspect of a political document to the public, but I think it's very much a case that the bare minimum is absolutely being done there. Like, February 9th marked 6 months of solid democratic protest, but how far have we actually come forward? Like, February 24th, we're talking 200 days since the protests began. Like, you can achieve a lot in 200 days, but what this has actually achieved is, in the grand scheme of the goal, the bare minimum, but it has also kept its momentum so strongly. It does demonstrate that there's no chance that this movement is going to fraction at any point. Like, throughout this process, it's not lost any momentum whatsoever. In terms of arrests and things, on February 10th alone, there was the detention of 668 students and 454 minors in one day. That is the force of people crying out for change, and that remains strong. It remains united. But the support on an international level has absolutely been limited. It's limited to an acknowledgement of solidarity with Belarus rather than active action. So in terms of diplomatic assistance, so there is, again, apologies for the pronunciation. I think I've well and truly exemplified that my speech and pronunciation generally linguistically needs a lot of work, so I do apologize about this. But Dirk Stefan Schnubel is a diplomat and is an economist from Germany. So he serves in the European External Action Service as the head of the delegation of the European Union to Belarus, and that has been since 2019. And previously he's been the head of the delegation to the European Union to Moldova from November 2009 until mid-2013. So he also spoke about sanctions and this numerous attempts to get into pre-trial detention facilities where political prisoners were held, and about EU assistance to Belarus. He explained why the EU cannot declare that the riot police, so they are called the OMON, so that's OMON, and they're sort of like the forces used by Lukashenko throughout this protest, why we can't declare that as a terrorist organisation. And there is also a sort of programme called the GUBOPIK, and they are the main directorate for combating organised crime being the protests, being the right to facilitate and carry out free speech. And basically this guy is denying calling that a terrorist organisation, and in turn is not accepting that this is a violation of human rights. It's saying more not doing something than it is physically doing something. It's definitely leaving it unsaid to achieve the agenda, I would say. Again, the political in terms of political prisoners within Belarus, the president of the European Council did demand the release of all political prisoners, and what has physically been done to
Sure.
move forward with that. It's one thing demanding it and saying, we want you to do this, and it's another thing actually starting to impose that. So in terms of like the contemporary side of that, so we're talking 3 days ago, so 22nd of February, Tikhanovskaya called the sanctions that have been imposed by the European Union on Belarusian leadership a mockery, which again is what sort of we've just examined there. So these sanctions that have been placed have only been placed on 90 people. And that is a complete mockery of the democratic movement, and it just completely allows Lukashenko's regime to continue. And she demanded that Western countries stop the financial support of Lukashenko's regime. So this is something that's still ongoing. So it's all well and good pledging your allegiance and sort of offering that one strand of it. But I would say that the most political action that has been taken on a cultural scale. So Belarus is to be excluded from the Eurovision Song Contest. So obviously there is been an ongoing discussion of the Eurovision Song Contest representing a wider political agenda for quite some time. But I would say that the EBU, which is the sort of operating body of that, has done the most to impose limitations upon Lukashenko at this point. They've actually taken some sort of action in sort of disregarding them from Europe, if you will. And it's just a song contest, but it's just the first stance. And in terms of like other cultural moments that are happening to sort of denounce Lukashenko, 25 members of the European Parliament did call upon the president of the European Cycling Union to move this year's European Track Cycling Championship from Minsk. Again, it's a call to move away from that and to move move the discussion towards why it's being taken away, without the news outlets physically reporting the process. Them being excluded from these events, or a massive sports event not being held in its original location and being moved around, is something that will make the news and is something that will be discussed. Again, so the International Biathlon Union's questioned whether holding the Biathlon World Cup in Belarus in 2022. That's something that's massively pending, because obviously 2022 is a while away. It's not something that's due to happen this year, but it's due to civil unrest at this point. Again, it's taken a stance on something, but that's very much the limiting factors of it. And as I said before, Dominic Raab's offered solidarity and pledged Britain's allegiance with protesters, but that physically does not constitute change. It's a very delicate line of negotiation at this point. And I would say when we sort of look back at the idea of like a Cold War rhetoric, it's a lot easier to place limited amount of sanctions on someone so as not to cause geopolitical unrest, considering like the relationship that Belarus has with Russia and sort of how that could be perpetuated into a massive global warfare, essentially. I mean, obviously that's the very, very extreme of it, but this is sort of taking preliminary steps to counter that. But in the process, it's not physically changing anything or moving towards achieving the goals of the protests.
It is interesting that there, as a piece of analysis, it makes perfect sense to describe this situation as reminiscent of a Cold War environment.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it does make me speculate as to whether the framing of this as a Cold War topic does in some way enable Western governments to just kind of, okay, hands off, it's not part of our sphere of influence. We all know that the Cold War was the Cold War and we won it eventually, so the best thing to do is to just sort of step back and not get involved.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in terms of sort of like modern political affiliations and whatnot, I mean, it's very obvious that there was a different relationship between like Trump's America and Russia, and sort of where that will move with the Biden presidency is also, I feel like where Belarus sits on this hierarchy of agenda is much lower down, because again, it's not being discussed on like a global scale. But it would be interesting to see sort of the change of pace of discussion and the actions that will be taken?
No, definitely. I mean, it was. I mean, we're used to talking about current affairs in terms of sort of pre-Trump, and then now we're in this sort of post-Trump, hopefully, knock on wood, environment. And it is interesting that we still have these examples where reactionary governments seem to feel at liberty to be kind of openly reactionary, like the points that you were making earlier about, they're not afraid to evoke memories of very, very repressive episodes in their own history. So I wanted to just, if I could, press you a bit more on this issue of the flag,
okay,
and the extent to which Lukashenko seems to feel capable of designing a country for his people, rather than having to kind of negotiate and come up with some sort of compromise on what might be a Belarusian identity, or the idea of locking people up just for association with a flag. It seems a bit extreme.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I feel like that is the perfect description of the situation. It is creating a country for the purpose of the people without actually consolidating anything that the people want, desire, actively do, anything like that. I feel like that's a really good phrasing of it. Basically, the white, red, white flag has been completely branded as a symbol of extremism. And in terms of the history of that, I mean, obviously, I know I lightly touched on that before, but we can sort of discuss a little bit more that again. So the white, red, white flag has been used as a symbol of the oppression to the regime of Lukashenko ever since he replaced the flag following a controversial referendum in 1995. So whilst it's not officially banned from public usage, it is treated by authorities as an unregistered symbol. And that means that demonstration of it by political activists or sports fans can lead to arrests, confiscation of the flag, and a fine issued. So, as I said, it's based on a traditional coat of arms. And in 1918, which is obviously, we're talking like pre-Soviet Belarus, the flag was used by the Belarusian Democratic Republic before it became a Soviet republic. And like I said, after Belarus regained its independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, the white, red, white flag was reinstated and became the official banner until the 1995 referendum. So at every point, this is completely representative of a Belarus that is free from political oppression. Sort of moving towards democracy, which is why it's been engulfed by the democratic movement. At this point, Lukashenko is trying to brand this as a symbol of extremism, and that's another way to falsify charges, to create fear amongst the resistance, to try and disengage people from the resistance. It just really ups the ante and the threat that they face actually going out. I mean, in terms of what that has achieved, it hasn't physically deterred the movement's momentum at this point. It hasn't halted it. It hasn't caused it to like disintegrate further. So it's not necessarily had the impact that it was anticipated to have had. What it has done has seen a lot more of arrests, a lot more people who have been taken into police custody for possession of the flag. The most controversial, there are absolutely many. We could talk for so long about the thousands of charges that have been sort of hit upon the Belarusian people in the last 200 days. But basically, somebody hung out their washing on their balcony on their apartment, white, red, white. You can't say that wasn't a provocative situation. However, you also can't say that it was, because at the end of the day, it quite simply is some washing. This individual was arrested and sentenced to 7 days under Article 23.34 for display of the flag. So that just demonstrates how much law enforcement have cracked down on the protest and cracked down on this idea of extremism. They're massively branding it akin to Nazism and the swastika, and trying to get it sort of registered as the same sort of threat level, which obviously the limited number of individuals who are still pro-Lukashenko, which is absolutely limited, it's absolutely minority within Belarus. This is something else to sort of peddle their own belief that the democratic movement is like the radical extremist fascist movement, rather than just accepting what they live in as a fascist dictatorship.
Sure.
So that is an example of sort of unbelievable extremes and how this has been twisted into something that it's just completely not. And it's absolutely a classic move to deter and prevent the protests. So it's obvious that more must be done to sort of stop this, because it's not fair that somebody can be charged for displaying a flag, displaying a terrorist symbol, when all they've done is hung their washing out. Like, we can't.
Sure.
Again, I do very much appreciate that it is an act of resistance to do it in that
Sure.
way, to make headlines and to do something, but you can't limit someone to that degree that they've got to second guess every action they take for fear of being taken away, for being imprisoned, for being charged under what is essentially a falsified charge.
Sure. Or to have a photograph of you taken that has this flag somewhere in the background, or, you know, at worst some sort of deep fake where if this flag can be found in any way associated with you, then this opens you up to all sorts of investigation.
Yeah,
you know, in light of all this, it is, I know you've said before, you know, we're 200 days into this protest, but it's almost amazing that, you know, 200 days at first might not seem like a lot, but actually this does sound like an awful lot if there's this amount of repressive surveillance put onto these people.
Absolutely. I mean, in terms of like what that has actually done, so, February 24th was the 200th day. So what's today, the 26th? So we're 202 days deep. So,
Sure.
that is resultant of a cumulative 63,953 days of arrest issued to Belarusian individuals. That's 175 years. And $730,000 of fines. That's in 202 days.
Wow. And it's still going.
Yeah.
Only set to get bigger.
No, the growth of the movement, obviously, eventually everyone will realize this is what they want, but the movement is so large scale already. I think because we don't have that like media representation, we could never understand how large scale it is. Again, it's very similar to the protests that have been going on in India as well, the idea that there's no news coverage, so we're just like oblivious completely.
It definitely does sort of as we're talking about it, there is definitely this sensation I'm getting that like the onus has been maybe on these people for a bit too long to bring about the democratic change that we all think we're entitled to. And it does raise this specter of exactly what people outside of Belarus can demand of their governments, or what is available to them to try and assist this movement. I know that there was a statement from the Belarusian Prime Minister Golovchenko recently, who sort of issued a threat that if Western governments take a harder stance, I don't know if it necessarily would count as an aggressive stance, but if they stop some of the financing of the Belarusian regime, that the Belarusian regime will make an explicit about turn and entrench its relationships with Russia and even China. I know you've already said that, you know, there's a very neo-colonial relationship between Belarus and Russia, but is this statement something that we should be worried about?
I mean, I feel like that in itself is very much calling up everything that I've said so far about this Cold War context. Like, it seems really heavily entrenched in this Cold War rhetoric that's almost been like forced upon it. Like, nobody needed that to get involved as well. Like, it's just sort of come part and parcel because of the historic legacy of the places that are involved. So Golovchenko is a Belarusian politician. He's been the nation's prime minister since the 4th of June 2020. All right. And he has suggested that Belarus will have to invest more than $200 billion into economic development and infrastructure projects between 2021 and 2025. Obviously, going back to the damages that will have been caused by the protests, that'll be something that'll be massively feeding into this as well, and sort of like this idea of demonizing the protests as not peaceful, to sort of encourage financial stimulation from other countries as well. And the idea that, well, if you want us to achieve this social change, if you want us to achieve this economic change, you do have to aid us in this way, because financially this is a nation that is not only dependent on Russia, but agriculturally, that is their main industry. Like where is the same economic development? It hasn't been allowed under Lukashenko. That he has never put the modernization of the economy as something that is a prevalent issue, which is obviously now something that is massively problematic for the people who are sort of like calling to arms for the democracy movement, calling to arms for basic human rights.
Sure.
And infrastructure to access education, healthcare provisions, everything like that. So in turn, they're asking for this monetary financing from other nations. But as I said previously, Svetlana has called for nations to stop funding Lukashenko's regime. Like, she obviously wants to achieve this social change, and she wants to achieve the change of infrastructure. But if they facilitate that through Lukashenko's government, what they're essentially saying is, you are right, they're giving him the green light to continue with his regime. So as you previously said, Golochenko suggests that if the West refuses to give the loans, which is earmarked for roads, hospitals and sports complexes, this is the quote, there is Russia, China and other Asian countries. So that sparks very much undertones of the Cold War era tensions. It's this us versus them, and the investment of Belarusian polity is sort of a vested interest for Western individuals. Otherwise, it's this idea that it's going to succumb to Russia, whatever that means. It's very much already entrenched in the Russian agenda. So Lukashenko's regime, as I said, has this very much playing ball with this, that they know how to sort of manipulate the situation to their favour. They're providing a situation whereby if you go against us, we have an ally in Russia. If you go with us, we will still be allied with Russia. There's no escape in that at this point, which is why more intervention needs to be done.
Well, that's a mixed optimistic message, I guess. It is definitely interesting that for all that we're hearing about the geopolitical significance of Belarus, that it can still be something that, I mean, I've never talked to anybody around me about this issue. I've never seen a news broadcast about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you were to make a stab at prediction, where do you see this protest going? Where do you see the... I'm not going to ask you to jinx it by saying is it going to be successful or not, but what do you think the future holds for Belarus or for Lukashenko? Maybe it's easier to...
I think the movement at this point has gained more traction than any democratic protest has within Belarus previously. There is absolutely no turning back. I would definitely say, and I know we've touched on this a lot, but just to sort of like round it up together, that the idea of like forging a deep cultural connection is massively a propaganda tool used to coerce a sense of shared identity. It creates a collective memory for its inhabitants. It attempts to evoke sentiments of patriotism, pride, solidarity. That's backfired now. There's no turning back. These people have made their minds up on what Lukashenko has offered them. With regards to the relationship between the newly sovereign Belarus and the Russian Federation, in order to like coerce their political identity, their cultural identity encourages public consumption of a shared tradition and history, and that's continuously shaping the future, not only in a social sense, but very much a political sense. Like even the example of the quote from Golochenko that we just discussed moments ago, that is very much placing its allegiance with Russia at the forefront of Belarus's progression. Like there's no denying that. And I would very much say that Lukashenko was reliant on dated means to forge a moment of stability in this sort of plight of the continuation of his authoritarian regime. The Belarusian political identity has massively and very ironically created a new collective identity for the Belarusian people, and that is a one that stands united against Lukashenko, calling out for democracy. So what we have actually created here in forcing this alliance with Russia is a counterculture and a counter-Lukashenko movement, and that has truly been his own doing through every regressive step that's been taken from his ascent to power in 1994. It's absolutely a cumulative effect of all of that. The 2020 protests have faced violent persecution by the authorities, and these arrests, as I said, have claimed violence, torture, and that's obviously just continuously increasing. Like in one day to arrest over 1,000 people is absolutely obscene. Like that just demonstrates that the movement has never faltered in its speed or its determination for what it's trying to achieve. At the start of this month, obviously this figure will have changed, but as of February 3rd, there was 221 political prisoners residing in Belarus, and they were detained under falsified charges. So they're long-term political prisoners. And obviously the protesters are demanding peacefully what they want, and that has been met with absolute brute force. So Belarusian democratic activism was born out of 1989 protests against Soviet oppression, and the activism of Belarusians now in present day contemporary society completely mirrors that of 1989 and again in 1991. And that is a call that's been constantly yelled at the top of their voices to sort of denounce the reconstituted remnants of the Soviet Union built by Lukashenko's regime, to completely eradicate that from Belarusian polity. That is a continuous agenda throughout. It's not simply something that's happened in the 2020 protests. The 2020 protests are just an example of a success for this movement. It's continuously happened. There's been previous protests before that have tried and failed because it wasn't unified in the same way it was. And I'm very, very happy to say that the one time that it has succeeded and it is beginning to make massive traction was because of the leadership of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. Like she is the woman who has changed the face of Belarusian polity without a doubt. Like in terms of the pandemic, that was the straw that broke the camel's back in the eyes of the public. Lukashenko completely ignored WHO recommendations, and there is evidence to suggest that sort of the deaths within Belarus but from COVID-19 are 10 times higher than official statistics. There's no way of ever at this point being able to, I know it's absolutely crazy, being able to grab a realistic number right now. Maybe upon reflection people can estimate, and there will be sort of death tolls and statistics that will be released where you can collate this information, but right now it's total guesswork. And the UN reported an abnormal peak of mortality between April to June 2020. So obviously now there is a practice of infecting detained protesters in prisons with coronavirus. The Ministry of Health in Belarus never published a plan for the vaccine. This is something that Svetlana has massively asked the EU for help for. She's calling out for Belarusian vaccination, a nationwide campaign to help all adults, and that would have to be implemented third party in the form of a UN development programme. Obviously, this is quite terrifying. Like in terms of the coronavirus alongside the protests, like a massive part of COVID is social distancing, stay away from people, having large gatherings of protesters in spite of that, knowing that their healthcare is not sufficient enough under the structures that Lukashenko has in. These people are quite literally risking their lives against this virus, alongside risking their lives in the face of the terrorist police organizations that threaten them with violence, that threaten them with imprisonment, with fines. Like this is like well and truly the triple threat that they face, and the movement, in spite of all of these factors, has not deterred whatsoever. So in terms of like the polity that has been put through since the beginning of the movement, the retirement age was raised from 62.5 raised to 62.5 and 57.5 for men and women respectively. And income tax for employees has been raised from 9% to 13%, and VAT on medicines has been increased. That to me does not represent a Belarus that is changing in favour of what these democratic protests are calling for. It's quite literally giving them the opposite of what they're asking for. Sure. Which is why the movement hasn't faltered, it hasn't deterred, because that just spurs them on further to want to call for more change, to want to push for more change. But obviously in the way that they have reacted to previous protests is to lock down more, to toughen up, to bring in the camps, to bring in this idea of forced labour, to threaten individuals into silence. That is a relic of the USSR. Surely, like we can't discuss this without thinking about how obvious the tactic that is of their entire regime. So I think it's very, very interesting to question what the next step is when the protests are having, on a local scale, local Belarusian scale, they're having an adverse effect. on a global scale, it's encouraging more conversation about it, and it's encouraging countries to slowly become involved. I mean, I'm contradicting myself in that sense, because I know I have said they're not doing enough, but they're doing something. It's the start. Like, it will snowball, and it will be a sign that more is to come, I would say. But more has to happen sooner rather than later, because the steps of repression and the way that it's being cracked down upon at this stage has massively intensified. Like, we can't deny that whatsoever. In terms of where the movement's ultimate goals lie, so in an interview which is with Euronews, it's available on YouTube, so Svetlana just lays out her goals, and that interview basically explains that she is an interim president. Obviously, as we discussed before, she never ran as president herself. It was her husband. She ran in place of her husband to fulfill his agenda, and she ran in place for her country. She's completely risked everything at this point. Her children, obviously, now out of the country. She's had no contact with them throughout this period. She's been constantly monitored. There is a threat. There's a death toll on her head. Like, everything is stacked against her, but continuously she's making progress. And these are all very small breakthroughs, but nonetheless, they're breakthroughs in themselves. That is enough to say that the movement will go where it needs to go. So basically, she wants to be an interim president between Lukashenko and his removal. Obviously, she'll reinstate the constitution to reaffirm 2 terms max, and she will ensure that there is a free and fair election that runs for Belarus, with all political candidates allowed to run who were denied to run in the 2020 election, and essentially she will pave the way to democracy. Her movement into politics and into the parliament itself is not a signifier of democracy being in Belarus. Like, that is not, I've done everything now. There is the work alongside that needs to go ahead to facilitate a democratic election, at which point somebody who was previously denied to run, who is representative of what the democratic movement actually want, will stand in place and will be able to give Belarus exactly what it needs and what it wants at this point.
Well, we can definitely hope that the reckoning will be coming sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
That it will come out in the way that we all want.
No, it's pretty crazy. Like, the coverage of it, I know I've said this quite a few times, it's non-existent. Like, about 2 weeks ago, my grandma handed us a cutting that she'd taken from the newspaper, and if it was 3 bullet points, and she said, "Oh, it's on Belarus, I thought you'd be interested in looking at it." And I remember thinking, how is it possible that there is 3 bullet points? It was that big. It was so tiny.
Sure.
On this massive movement that it is starting to have a ripple effect on a global scale. Like, when we start to look at all of the different factors, the economic factors that are coming into it, like in a COVID sense, like, until we actually have strong statistics for COVID for every nation, we're never going to truly know how free we are globally. So everything that feeds into it will slowly start to drip feed through, but it's just very scary that it's taken this long and it's this limited.
You're right. I mean, it's the same year that gave us sort of the worst of what was possible with the pandemic has also shown some lights of what is possible in a positive sense. Even just the risks that people are willing to take to fight for change, which they're paying the costs of, it can't help be heartwarming.
I think, heartwarming is definitely the right word. And I think that these people are willing to risk it all because what they have right now, I think it really highlights how bad the situation is under Lukashenko, how much they are, not even a case of risking, but experiencing to push him out. And I think that's a point that I really need to drive home with that. Like, yes, all of the conditions that I have described are terrible, but in light of what they have, that's nothing.
Sure. It's definitely a message that I think the world needs to hear a bit more of. Well, more than a bit more of.
Yeah, I know.
hope we can do something towards that.
Definitely. I think there's definitely a very optimistic tone with it. Like, all of the information that I have given sounds very, very negative. But I mean, it is an infringement of human rights, and there's literally no way to discuss that in a positive way, apart from the fact that it's symbolic of change, and apart from the fact that that change is coming soon, and soon
Sure.
we'll look at it and say, how did we let this happen? Let's never do it again. I mean, not that that's ever been the case of history
Sure.
not repeating itself, but it's idyllic to think, is it not?
Well, you got to have a utopia to aim for. It's certainly true.
Yeah, exactly. If it was my way, the socialist utopia, the haven that I envision for my own future,
Yeah.
would be there. But we
Oh,
can't have it always, all the time.
There you go, viewers. You heard it here first. I'm just slightly conscious that the clock is running ahead of us, but I'm really impressed that you've been able to bring actually quite a few sources and quite a few references for our viewers and listeners to check out. Do you mind running through some of them again?
Of course. So, in terms of my own very vain plugging of my own work, my Instagram is at the road to Belarusian democracy, and I try and repost a lot of different sources on there. So there's a lot of the sources that I've actually got my information from. I try and do a daily post, but sometimes that doesn't happen. But the incredible page that I've spoken about throughout is Voices from Belarus. That is honestly amazing if you're looking for a bit more information to realise the scale of this operation. It goes into a lot of detail about individuals who've been arrested, so like individual cases of massively extreme violations, and it follows them through. So every time there's a further update of that, it does another post on it. I'm not quite sure who the individual who runs the page is, but it's absolutely incredible. So I would really recommend checking that out. And obviously it does sort of link other pages as well. There's also artists with Belarus who post artwork of Belarusian artists who are creating pieces that stand in solidarity with the democracy movement. I know somebody created like a massive embroidered blanket was the word that I forgot there. Massive embroidered blanket that had sort of like this really medieval sort of battle scene depicted on it, but it was like a certain number that represented the amount of prisoners who had been taken into prison since the protest started until this was completed. Obviously that's ironic because it's ongoing, but that was really interesting. So that's another really great page. And there's a couple linked on Voices from Belarus that, again, the international Belarusian community, so like individuals who live in different nations who have created an Instagram page to stand in solidarity with the movement. So that's a great way to sort of get the international feel for it and to see the protests that are happening on a global scale, small scale, but global scale. So I guess you would just call that a big scale anyways,
All progress is good progress.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Emma, thanks very much. This has been so insightful, so well researched. We're very happy to endorse that our viewers go and look at your page. Really, an awful lot said about a very worrying situation, but it's so heartwarming to be able to see little nuggets of optimism. This is not an optimism-filled time, but I'm really thankful that you decided to talk to us, and you could share some of this with us. Cool. And to everyone listening, thanks for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe to Res Publica Politics for more up-to-date current affairs analysis, and follow us on social media. And from all of us here, thanks and be well. Cool. Bye.